Before every major economic collapse, the world always tells itself the same story. This time, nothing can go wrong. In the late 1920s, that story was louder than ever. People danced, borrowed, speculated, and got rich on paper, right before the global economy suffered the worst collapse in modern history. This is not just the tale of a stock market crash. This is the story of how an entire system slowly strangled itself, and why the warning signs are never as obvious as we want them to be. If you had walked through New York, London, or Berlin in the late 1920s, you wouldn't have guessed that disaster was coming. Shops were full. Factories were busy. Cities buzzed with cars, jazz clubs, cinemas, and neon signs. The First World War was over. Industrial production had surged, and new technologies were transforming daily life. Radios carried music and news into living rooms. Electrical appliances promised comfort and convenience. Cars turned distance into an inconvenience rather than a barrier. To most people, it felt like history had finally turned a corner. War and hunger belonged to the past. The future looked like a straight line going up. But prosperity has a dark habit. When things look safest, people start taking the biggest risks. The 1920s were not just good times, they were a structural shift. Industrial output rose sharply. Productivity improved as companies adopted assembly line methods pioneered in places like Detroit. Mass production drove down the cost of consumer goods, and advertising pushed those goods into every corner of society. At the same time, credit exploded. Instead of saving first and buying later, millions of households flipped the script. Buy now, pay later. Furniture, radios, cars, refrigerators, all could be bought on installment plans. The financial system wrapped itself around this new consumer lifestyle and quietly tied people to years of payments. Underneath the glow, imbalance grew. Wages did not keep up with productivity. Farmers were already suffering from low prices and high debts. Europe struggled with war damage and reparations. But the stock market did not seem to care. Shares of major companies climbed year after year. Newspapers glorified investors, who started with small savings and ended with fortunes. The idea that, quote, the market always goes up in the long run, became less of an observation and more of a religion. This mixture, easy credit, rising inequality, and a booming stock market, created something extremely fragile. An economy that looked healthy because it was burning tomorrow's money to pay for today's lifestyle. In theory, stock markets exist to connect savings with businesses that need capital. In the late 1920s, they became something else entirely. Ordinary people were no longer buying shares because they believed in a company's long-term success. They were buying because prices had been going up, and everyone around them acted like that was normal. The key accelerant was buying on margin. Instead of paying the full price of a stock, investors could put down only a fraction and borrow the rest from brokers or banks. If the stock went up, returns were magnified. If it went down, losses were magnified, and lenders demanded their money back. It worked brilliantly right up until the moment it didn't. Banks and financial institutions joined the party. Some used depositors, savings to speculate in the market, blurring the line between safe banking and risky betting. As prices rose, more people felt compelled to jump in. No one wanted to be the boring person sitting on cash while their neighbors talked about easy money. By 1929, stock prices had completely detached from the slowing reality underneath. Industrial growth was cooling. Global demand was weakening. Farm incomes were under pressure. But as long as charts pointed up, very few wanted to ask hard questions. Speculation is a bit like building a tower out of chairs. It looks impressive until someone moves one piece at the bottom. By the autumn of 1929, the market's rise began to falter. A few large investors quietly sold. Others noticed. Selling accelerated. On several days in late October, prices fell so quickly that the usual tricks to calm markets were overwhelmed. The most famous of these days became known as Black Tuesday, when a tidal wave of sell orders crushed prices and wiped out fortunes. But here's the important nuance. The crash did not cause the Great Depression on its own. It was the spark, not the bomb. The real damage was psychological. People who had believed in a permanent boom suddenly saw how quickly paper wealth could disappear. Borrowers who had used margin faced margin calls they couldn't meet. They were forced to dump their shares at any price, pushing the market even lower. Confidence, that invisible fuel of modern economies, went into freefall. Businesses postponed investment. Households cut back spending. Banks became more cautious. The economy began to contract, but the worst was still ahead, hiding not in the stock exchange, but behind the counters of local banks. In the early 1930s, the United States did not have deposit insurance. If your bank failed, your savings went with it. Many banks had lent aggressively during the 1920s, including to speculators. When loans turned sour after the crash, those banks became vulnerable. Rumors about a bank's weakness were often enough to trigger panic. Once a few institutions failed, fear spread. Customers lined up outside branches to withdraw everything, not just in troubled banks, but in completely solvent ones. This phenomenon, known as a bank run, is lethal even to a healthy bank. No institution can pay out all deposits at once, because most of that money is loaned out or invested. Between 1929 and 1933, roughly one-fifth of all American banks disappeared. Millions of people saw their savings evaporate. As banks collapsed and survivors became more cautious, the amount of money circulating in the economy shrank dramatically. Estimates suggest that the U.S. money supply fell by around 30% in just a few years. This wasn't just a technical issue. It meant there was literally less money available to pay wages, make loans, or buy goods. Prices fell, wages fell, but debts stayed the same. That combination, deflation plus fixed debts, crushed households, farms, and businesses. The tragedy is that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, largely failed to stop this collapse. Later research, including work by economists like Milton Friedman and Ben Bernanke, would argue that allowing the money supply to contract so sharply turned a severe recession into a historic depression. Statistics can't fully capture what the Great Depression felt like for ordinary people. At its worst point, American unemployment is estimated to have reached roughly 25%. In some towns and sectors, the reality was even harsher. Factories that once operated around the clock stood silent. Smokestacks went cold. Warehouses filled with unsold goods. In cities, long lines formed outside soup kitchens. Families doubled up in cramped apartments or moved into improvised settlements built from scrap wood and metal. These shanty towns became known, bitterly, as Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for failing to halt the crisis. In rural areas, farmers faced a different kind of nightmare. Agricultural prices collapsed, making it impossible to cover debts and taxes. Some lost land that had been in their families for generations. Others produced crops that were worth so little they could barely afford to harvest them. And then the climate turned against them too. The Great Depression overlapped with one of the worst ecological disasters in modern U.S. history, the Dust Bowl. Decades of intensive plowing on the Great Plains had removed native grasses that held the soil together. When severe drought hit in the 1930s, that unprotected soil dried out and turned to dust. Strong winds lifted it into the air and carried it for hundreds of kilometers. Enormous black blizzards rolled over farms, towns, and roads, turning day into night. Dust seeped into houses despite wet cloth stuffed in cracks. Livestock suffocated. Crops failed completely. The Dust Bowl did not cause the Great Depression, but it made it far worse for the roughly one-third of Americans who still lived from agriculture. Many families abandoned their homes and migrated west in search of work. Others stayed and endured years of hardship that would later be immortalized in novels, songs, and photographs. While banks and factories collapsed in the cities, the soil itself was collapsing in the countryside. During the early years of the crisis, policymakers believed the downturn would fix itself. It didn't. By 1933, the situation was so severe that a different approach became unavoidable. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the White House and launched a wave of measures known collectively as the New Deal. These policies didn't follow a single theoretical blueprint. They were a mix of experiments aimed at three basic goals: relief, help for people who were suffering immediately; recovery, getting the economy moving again; reform, changing the system so the same disaster would be less likely in the future. Banks were temporarily closed and allowed to reopen only if examiners judged them sound. New rules separated safer commercial banking from riskier investment activities. Deposit insurance was created so that ordinary people would no longer lose everything if a bank failed. Public works programs hired millions to build roads, bridges, dams, and public buildings. Social safety nets like unemployment insurance and old age pensions began to take shape. The federal government started to accept a new role, not just as a referee, but as an active player in stabilizing the economy. Economists still debate exactly how much the New Deal contributed to recovery versus later events like the huge expansion of government spending during World War II. But few dispute that these reforms fundamentally reshaped banking, finance, and social policy for the rest of the 20th century. The Great Depression was not confined to the United States. It spread through trade, financial links, and the gold standard to much of the world. As unemployment rose and economies shrank, political tensions intensified. Governments responded in different ways. Some introduced social programs and reforms. Others turned inward, raising tariffs to protect domestic industries. One of the most infamous examples was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 in the United States, which raised import duties on thousands of products. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. In just a few years, global trade shrank by about 2/3. Instead of saving jobs, these protectionist measures deepened the slump and fueled international resentment. In several countries, economic misery helped extremist movements gain support. Leaders promised simple answers to complex problems and blamed internal or external enemies for the crisis. In Europe and Asia, this contributed to the rise of aggressive regimes that would soon push the world toward a new conflict. By the late 1930s, as nations rearmed and prepared for war, factories reopened, and unemployment fell sharply. In that grim sense, the Second World War finally did what policy alone had not fully achieved. It pulled major economies out of the Depression through massive, sustained government spending on the military. It's a disturbing truth. The worst economic crisis of the modern era slowly faded because an even greater disaster began. So what do we actually learn from all this, beyond the dates and the names? First, booms are dangerous when they are built on debt and denial. The 1920s looked strong, right up until the moment they broke. Easy credit, speculative bubbles, and complacent policy created a fragile structure that could not withstand a shock. Second, banking systems are not just plumbing. They are the bloodstream of the economy. When thousands of banks failed and the money supply shrank by about 1/3, the result wasn't abstract. It was factory closures, mass unemployment, and shattered lives. Third, global cooperation matters. Policies like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs showed how quickly countries can drag each other down when they respond to crisis by closing doors instead of coordinating. Fourth, government inaction can be as damaging as government mistakes. The choice to let banks fail and money contract without aggressive intervention turned a sharp downturn into a decade-long trauma. Finally, and maybe most importantly, economic disasters rarely feel inevitable when you're living just a few years before them. They feel normal, optimistic, comfortable. That's why studying the Great Depression isn't nostalgia, it's self-defense. The Great Depression was not simply about numbers on charts. It was about families losing homes, farmers watching fields turn to dust, workers lining up for bread, and entire societies questioning whether the future could ever be trusted again. Today's world is different in countless ways. Banking rules are stronger. Central banks act faster. Safety nets exist where none did before. But some patterns never fully disappear. Debt that grows faster than income, markets that forget risk, politics that gambles with trade and trust. History doesn't repeat itself in perfect loops, but it does leave fingerprints. And if there's one message the Great Depression still whispers to us, it's this. When everyone believes the system can't break, that's exactly when you should start asking where the cracks are.